the little art jam before the art jam.
It's already started.
Yeah, no. What is the host if not late? Let's do it. Thanks everybody for coming here. This is going to be awesome. I really appreciate y'all. We are recording it if everybody's okay with that. Voices might be on there. Cool. Let's do it. My name's Kelly. I'm the operations director here. I get to curate the gallery and the venue and help run the studios and internship programs and do different outreach. Get to meet people like Atlas fairly often, but Atlas is a standout individual, as we all know, and that's why we're here. So yeah, we're here to talk about your show, how the show got here, and where it's gonna go. What I was thinking we could start with, just like, let's take us all the way back to when did you start becoming interested in visual art and poetry with that and music, or which came first?
Yeah. I would definitely say poetry always came first, but I painted a lot when I was a kid, and I wasn't really encouraged with art growing up, and so it wasn't until like later in my adult life I picked it back up, essentially. I like painted here and there, but I've always been a writer. And I've just now kind of gotten comfortable sharing my poetry publicly for the first time in the past like 2 years.
Really?
Yeah.
You're very comfortable showing it. You present very comfortable. I would have figured it was longer than that.
No, it's really been like the past 2 years. I've actually been sharing my poetry more openly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a cool question. With that, like, how did poetry start to influence your visual art? If it did, was that like a progression in it?
Yeah, I definitely, I would say I've always been like a storyteller. When I was a kid, I used to write like short stories. I attempted to try to write a novel. That's been long lost since moving a bunch growing up, but I've always kind of like had pictures in my mind and ideas, and I just kind of got to a place where like, okay, maybe I want to try and explore some of these themes. With painting is more of a cathartic act of like working through emotions more so. But I would say doing the video work and like the puppet show is more connected with the poetry, like writing that story and coming up with the visuals. Painting, I think, is more so me like processing my feelings.
It's very interesting. It's like painting, like processing feelings from poetry that like get brought up, or just like that's really cool. So painting's kind of like the support to writing and that process of, it sounds like exposing yourself, at least to like yourself, you know, and like being vulnerable, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's really cool. You paint with really bright colors quite often. Does that play into like a mood or an expression like along with that? Like, is it something to say, hey, I want to be bright and loud after this, or like, are you empowered, you feel, or?
You know, I am definitely an artist with like what is available and around to me. So like I would explore different colors, but I don't really know color theory. And a lot of times like the paint that I have accessible is like what I use. And also to kind of tie back, usually when I'm painting, I'm also writing poetry. Like as I'm throwing color on the canvas, like words are coming and I'm writing everything down as the process goes. But color-wise, I haven't thought too much about, you know, because a lot of the times, a lot of the themes with my paintings are like really heavy topics. So I guess like that juxtaposition of like bright colors and heavy feelings, but really it's just kind of like what color is available to me is what I'll use.
Nice. Punk, but then I like that because it's like what's available, but then like how do you use it for yourself? And not just like the medium. That's pretty cool. Before we get it, so when did you also making a lot of puppets and videos and like performance art world? When did that start coming in, and did those characters, because you paint a lot of characters, I've noticed too, like what's the play between painting characters and then creating like 3D wearable versions of that in your canon?
Yeah, I would say the painting characters is really more of like a subconscious act. I never really go into a painting exactly knowing what I'm going to do. It's more so like I throw the color on, and then as I see the shapes in the colors, I outline it with Posca paint pen. So those characters kind of come up without thinking about it. The video and puppet work that I do is very intentional. That kind of started, I think it was maybe March of 2022. I've had this reoccurring dream since I was a kid, like really since I could remember, of this guy, Mr. Peripheral, who I've named him, who is this blue man of my dreams. And I had a lot of like nightmares growing up, and this blue guy was always in my dreams, but he never helped me. He never like touched me. He was just always there in my peripheral. And for a long time I was like, if this is an extension of myself, why am I not helping myself? And so I really struggled with that for a long time, because like I felt like I was never getting rest and I wasn't helping myself, and I was like, I need to explore this guy outside of my dream world, you know? And so I started to develop Mr. Peripheral, and so like that puppet show essentially is like Mr. Peripheral goes to sleep, and when he goes to sleep it goes into that stop motion dream world where he's kind of exploring whatever themes I'm like dealing with and struggling with.
That's awesome. Good job.
Thanks.
Good job. That's so cool to be able to actively process and then actively like learn more about yourself and what you need out of art, instead of just like the drive. We live in a very fast moving society that, you know, we're compelled to create the most or do the most or be prolific in that way, and to be prolific in listening to your body and listening to your mind is refreshing. Cool. So that's kind of where we're at now. You've been working on the show for technically a long time and in a few different places. Where did the show start? And then how did we get to Bellingham?
Yeah. You know, I'll be honest, I never really thought I'd ever have a show. I just kind of, so January 10th of 2022, I decided to get sober from a decade-long era of drinking, and my way of processing all of the trauma that I've been through throughout my life was painting and writing poetry. And so the first painting in there, Disguised Distinguished Intuition, was just kind of like me trying to create some version of myself that I liked and I felt comfortable with. And since from then on, I've just like used painting as a way to kind of get those heavier emotions out. And I would say that once I got to Bellingham, I mean, my style really kind of exploded. I've never really been in a place where people were really supportive of each other in the arts. I kind of was around more of like, let's execute a skill, and that skill is realism. And anything outside of that is just like, we're not taking you seriously. And really it was like Bellingham kind of gave me the wings, especially y'all, really truly gave me kind of the wings to be like, make the weird shit, push it even further, you know, and explore with more like the 3D textures. I don't know if that really answered your question.
No, you did. That's how we got here. Because it is cool. When did you move to Bellingham?
May of last year.
That's it?
Yeah.
We've been hanging out a lot. That's wild. So remember, Atlas wrote to us when you were planning to move here.
Yeah.
And you're not the only person that's done that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally. It's happened before. And I'm always like, maybe we'll see you in 8 months or something, you know? But for backstory, Atlas wrote us and just was looking for an art community before they moved here, and did their own research in a positive internet way and found us. And then I believe you came to an open mic night.
Yeah.
And you said, I'm Atlas, and it's like, I'm Kelly, I was the one that did wrote your email back, and then from there we just rolled. So
yeah,
look how much you've gotten done in a year. That's
seriously. I think it was the 4th day I was in Bellingham. I came here and then introduced myself and read my poetry on stage and didn't know anybody.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Came in swinging. So if anybody else wants to come in swinging like that, we are here for you. Open mics on second Saturdays forever. And feel free to email and we can just chat if you want. Cool. So when we curated this show, we decided that we were going to do it in a specific order for a walkthrough. Could you take us through, if we were to walk through in your vision of how and why we did it that way?
Yeah, I think it's this show in particular, the fact that I didn't think I would ever have a solo show, it was really important to me for it to be like a biography, an autobiography in that sense of like how I got to this point. And so it was really important to me to kind of start with like really in chronological order. And you know, I think I had just mentioned before we kind of started doing the interviews that like once you enter the second room, this is all work that I've done since being in Bellingham. But it was just really kind of important to me to kind of show the process and how I've changed over time, really. And like a lot of the themes are kind of similar, but the further we get to these paintings, the more I think I'm allowed myself to play more with those heavy topics. I think if you look at the older paintings in the front room, it's a little more flat. Maybe I wasn't feeling super comfortable and safe to go even bigger, but looking at the older work is kind of like I feel more emboldened to kind of like really throw it out there more so than I was maybe 2 years ago.
That's cool. That's interesting to be metacognitive in that way of like noticing when you're transitioning to this like, now I'm just kind of like doing it, you know, like this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
Somebody brought up one of somebody's interpretations of the show that they knew that it went sequentially at Art Walk, and then there's the performance art piece in the corner that's been a sculpture installation right now, but you were performing that whole time, and somebody was like, yeah, this show's sequential and it goes all the way around, and then the last piece is actually getting made in front of us right now, which I thought was a really interesting, I just hadn't thought of it in that way. Did you have a plan? How did the performance art piece like interact in the curation of that? Was that a plan for you to like create the last piece with us?
Yeah. I didn't think about it in those terms really. I think it was more so the fact that I was really heavily thinking about this as like a autobiography. I wanted to hold space for like little Atlas who just really desperately wanted to be told that like it was okay to be weird, it was okay to like make the messed up art that I was making as a child, and I wanted to like hold space for him. And I think I wrote, maybe I don't remember if it was in my statement or my biography, but when I was little, I didn't have a lot of space to explore my imagination. I grew up in kind of a tumultuous childhood, but at night, when I used to suffer from night terrors and nightmares literally every night for years of my childhood, but I used to play with it. So like when I would wake up from like a night terror, I would see like shadows and colors bouncing in my room, and I'd be so terrified. Thanks to Chucky, I was scared of all of my dolls in my room. But I used to just kind of like stare and start to see shapes, and it was almost like the shadows I would see would start to animate themselves and come to life. And so I was kind of really going back to my roots with where all of my imagination started, was just like playing with my nightmares. And so that space was kind of like honoring him.
I love it.
And giving space to that.
I love it. It's so cool to hear. I think I relate in a way. I just, not to insert myself, but maybe wondering if you had this, like when you were talking about like little Atlas and little you. Sometimes we get to these point where you have to grow up way too early and you lose like your childhood for a little bit, and being able to come back. And did you feel like, was there a point where you felt like you could go back to your childhood and kind of like start where you wanted to start? You know, like what you wanted to do?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, no, for real, yeah. It really felt, I'm not gonna lie, like after the performance I was definitely drained and exhausted because it was just very emotionally vulnerable. But it definitely felt like I gave myself permission that I was seeking outside of myself. That was, it was just really affirming. I felt like I gave myself the permission I always really wanted.
Yeah, that's cool. Good job. Has Bellingham influenced your art process? We've talked about it a little bit. I know there was a change, like a little bit of just like being more emboldened to go there, but like geographically or color or community, we've touched this a little bit, but like what else about Bellingham and like that change and coming here like influenced you to finish painting 15 more paintings and writing the amount that you have and the amount of performance that's come out?
You know, I think that a lot of times we talk about how you don't want to run away from your problems, and like that's very real and that's very true. However, I think that it really depends on your environment. You know, you're not going to blame a flower for not growing if the soil is not what it needs, nutrient-wise, right? And I think that for me, I think it was so important for me to try and find community. And I've just been so desperate to feel connected to other people. And since moving here and meeting all of y'all and Make.shift at large, I felt like I got the proper nutrients I needed to feel encouraged to actually bloom, you know? So I would say not so much like geographically. I have a history of like traveling around and hitchhiking around, and I've been a lot of places. So I would say maybe that some of that influences me, but not so much. I would definitely say it's community first.
Cool.
And really it's just coming here is kind of giving me that, the blossom, I guess. The encouragement from everyone being like, yeah, it's okay to do weird shit, you know?
Yeah. Speaking of like slightly unorthodox stuff, I've noticed with your poetry that you have displayed, there's quite a visual element to it.
Yeah.
And some of it's directional, but could you describe the poetry pieces and like why you decided to, are they comps of poems? Because just if you could describe the pieces and how we got to those.
Yeah, honestly, how I go about writing in general, it's almost like in segments, and those segments are things that I'll sit with for a while and then build from that. So I kind of wanted to create a visual where it really felt like I was taking you through my brain of like, I might sit with this section of words, and then from there it leads to this, and then from there to there to there to there. So it's almost kind of like follow the arrow and the X marks the spot to the last bit. And also too, some of the segments in the poems I feel like are entire poems themselves. The person who bought this poem apparently said the reason why they bought it was the segment that says, I didn't prove that I was worth it when I needed it the most. And you know, I just kind of want to like let people feel like they can just take what they wanted and leave that didn't resonate with them.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So to that, like, you're writing for yourself, but you're writing, are you writing to a greater audience when you're writing for yourself like that? Because it sounds like that was like a cool clue in there, where it's like you left something for somebody else. How much of a decision is that when you were like writing and figuring out how to present your poetry?
Yeah, you know, I would say this was actually the first time I wrote my poetry like thinking about how the audience was going to perceive it. A lot of times I don't think about that, but if you go like on my Instagram page and like kind of scroll back to some of the cringier stuff that I've made in the process, I did a lot of like video poetry where like I actually did a video for this poem, and it was more so I was trying to think of like invoking a feeling with the words, but this was actually the first time I thought about like, how do I really want the audience to experience it in this like more flat 2D dimension? Because my poetry, if it's not written down, it's like in video form, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's so interesting with writing, because writing can be just for you, it can be for everyone else, and the way you decided to include it into the show, I felt was very intentional and unique. It's cool.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I kind of felt like too, how the paper layout is like some of the bits feel like side quests in the journey and the writing in a way, but yeah, it was just definitely kind of like taking you through the map of my brain, and some things are entire poems themselves, and take what you want, leave what you don't.
When you were making this body of work, did you start thinking about like what's next? Did new ideas come out of this? Like what's the next plans coming out of it? And did those shift away from where we're at, or is it more of a continuation?
You know, I would definitely say something that I'm really excited I want to do when I kind of get more space and more resources is exploring the portrait series I kind of like started at the end of this. Once I did that self-portrait, I kind of thought about with my puppet show how I'll take certain parts of my personality, just like one aspect of my personality, and personify that entirely. I thought it would be a really cool idea with painting, exploring that a little bit more, like still kind of approaching it the same way where it's like the cathartic act of throwing the color on and seeing what comes, but being intentional of like, what part of my personality do I want to kind of explore. But yeah, definitely the two portraits kind of was like, oh, I want to explore that later.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you find out like new things about yourself that it's kind of like shelf that and then explore a little bit later?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when I was working on the over-explainer, I really thought about myself as kind of like a late diagnosed neurodivergent person, and how I over-explain. But then if you see there's mouths on the hand, a lot of times I over-explain by doing too much. So just kind of playing a little bit with that, just thinking about how do I over explain, but not just like with my words, but with my actions.
Interesting.
Like overextending maybe.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff we've been flying through, work-wise?
So, do you choose the texture stuff you use to be symbolic of something like the fuzzy kind of stuff you've got in there? How do you decide the non-paint components and like what does that represent in terms of like what do you want to project out of that painting?
Yeah, totally. You know, like I was kind of saying before, I'm definitely a product of like what I have available I will use. And with doing the puppet stuff, I just have so much excess felting. Also, I have a partner who is also a textile artist, and I'm very grateful I have access to those materials. But when I was doing that painting, I kind of wanted to give it a feel of like exposed guts. And I was like, I'm gonna try and see what it would look like with the felt. And then I had access to beads and kind of wanted it to feel kind of like exposed nerves, you know?
Right.
But once the painting part of it was done, to me it felt flat, and I wanted it to feel more like an exposed body. And I just experimented with using the felt because that's what I had available.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I what like the pine cone pieces you have too, like just like understanding that choice, you know, like
Yeah.
Like didn't use anything, but you decided to use little pieces of pine cones on there.
You know, that one, I think it was like 2 a.m. I was definitely smoking a joint, and I was like painting this bird, and I was like, this is too flat. I wanted to feel more like texture, and I literally had a pine cone on my altar next to my easel, and I just took it apart and glued it on the canvas.
Gotcha.
So it's really like what I have available I'm gonna use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so cool. It's so pumped. It comes out so intentional.
Yeah.
The way that you can that quickly transfer an emotion or a feeling or an expression into what's around and find it. Do you get stuck where you can't find something, or do you just make it happen when you make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's been times where like I definitely wanted to make things like in like if we were to talk back to like the early days of maybe when I was finishing the last paintings in Wilmington before I moved here, and I was making the Mr. Peripheral mask. I made that while I was in Wilmington. How I went about making that mask is so chaotic, and it was because like I just genuinely didn't know how these materials were, like how to use them. It was just like how I made the mask was I took aluminum foil, shaped it to my face, and was like, okay, what do I build off that? And then I didn't have newspaper or glue, but I had paper towels and flour, and so I paper mached it with a flour paste, and I'm like, okay, this isn't really looking what I want it to. And then I went to Michael's and got polymer clay, and then baked clay on top of that, which is just so wild to think now.
Yeah, it's heavy too.
It is heavy. That mask is heavy, but but like since coming here, my partner Birdie, she has a lot of experience in like sculptural work, and I've learned a lot from her. We collaborated on the sculpture piece together, but that's another thing too. Like since being in Bellingham, I've had more artists that are not so gatekeepy and like definitely willing to actually share the knowledge. I mean, like maybe try it like this, and it won't be so hard. But yeah, I definitely, some of the process of how I made stuff before was very chaotic, and it was just simply because I just didn't know how. But I definitely did make it, for sure.
You made it happen, yeah, totally, and it gets that ball rolling, and it's so interesting how chaotic things can be in general when we're by ourselves, and then when you have art in there too, you know, like a little bit of community and just a little bit of like a mountaintop perspective of like, why are you covered in flour and doing it that way right now? You don't notice, you know, you just don't notice you're doing it, and it's so wonderful to find people to create with and love with like that. It's awesome. Does anybody else have any questions from the media stuff? More? So
That's one. I see you do a lot of forms of art, from like sculptures to portraits, written work and performance. Is there any that like is your favorite to express yourself with, or construct, or create?
Yeah, that's really tough. In a perfect world where I had all my needs met and I had all my time to myself, I would definitely push harder for my puppet performance and the puppet show that I want to do. I feel really called to kind of really lean into that, but unfortunately I don't have a lot of time, but I make do. But I would definitely say the puppet. I mean, poetry always, like no matter what I'm doing, poetry is always going to be at the forefront of that, but definitely probably the performance and the video work that I do.
Yeah, that medium does take a lot.
Yeah.
A lot to get little pieces at a time up to something, and painting's so immediate. With that, painting's pretty immediate for you, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like a two expression. I'd love to go talk about a couple of these paintings with you and kind of shift the group over to kind of
Totally.
focus on them, if that's cool.
Yeah, love
You guys
to.
want to go check out a couple paintings? Let's do it.